The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Frank Morrison's cottage in Asheville, North Carolina, each droplet striking the glass like tiny fists demanding entry. At 63, Frank had grown to appreciate the solitude that the mountain weather provided. It gave him an excuse to stay inside with his woodworking projects and his thoughts, both of which had become his most reliable companions over the past 3 years. The cottage sat on 2 acres of land he'd purchased with his retirement savings, a modest but well-built structure that he'd renovated himself. Every board, every joint, every carefully sanded surface bore the mark of his calloused hands. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, weathered cedar siding and a simple metal roof, but it was his, bought and paid for with money he'd saved from 38 years of working construction. Frank was in his workshop, a converted garage that smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, when he heard the knock. The sound was tentative at first, barely audible over the drumming rain, but then it came again, more insistent. He set down the hand plane he'd been using to smooth a cherrywood tabletop and wiped his hands on the leather apron tied around his waist. Through the workshop's single window, he could see a figure hunched under the small overhang by his front door. Something about the posture, shoulders curved inward, head down, struck him as familiar, but the rain obscured details. Frank rarely received visitors. His neighbors, a retired couple named the Hendersons, occasionally stopped by with surplus vegetables from their garden, but they usually called first. He walked through the cottage's main room, past the stone fireplace where a modest fire crackled against the October chill, past the kitchen table he'd built from reclaimed barnwood, past all the simple furnishings that represented his new life, a life built from scratch after losing everything he thought mattered. The knock came a third time, more urgent now, as Frank reached for the door handle. He paused, his hand hovering over the deadbolt. In the 3 years since he'd moved to this mountain sanctuary, he'd learned to be cautious. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt, even when the person who'd shattered it was your own flesh and blood. Frank opened the door, and his world tilted sideways. Standing on his doorstep, soaked to the bone and shivering in clothes that had seen better days, was his son Marcus. At 35, Marcus had once been the picture of young professional success. Sharp suits, confident handshake, the kind of man who commanded respect in corporate boardrooms. Now he looked like he'd been sleeping in his car for days. His usually pristine hair hung in damp strings across his forehead, and his designer jacket was wrinkled and stained. "Hello, Dad," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The word "Dad" seemed to catch in his throat, as if he wasn't sure he still had the right to use it. Frank stared at his son, 3 years of suppressed emotions warring in his chest. Anger, hurt, disappointment, and, despite everything, a father's instinctive concern for his child's well-being. Marcus looked terrible, not just physically but spiritually diminished, as if life had been steadily eroding him from the inside out. "Marcus." Frank's voice was careful, neutral. He didn't step back to invite his son in, but he didn't close the door either. "What are you doing here?" Marcus started, then stopped, his teeth chattering from cold or nerves or both. "Can I come in, please? Just for a few minutes?" Frank studied his son's face, searching for signs of the man who had once stood in Frank's living room, the family home Frank had spent 20 years paying for, and told him he was no longer welcome. The man who had accused him of being a burden, of holding Marcus back from his real life. The man who had given him 30 days to find somewhere else to live because his new wife found Frank's presence uncomfortable. But all Frank saw now was a broken human being standing in the rain, and despite everything, he was still a father. "Come in," Frank said, stepping aside. Marcus entered hesitantly, dripping water onto the hardwood floor Frank had installed himself. He stood just inside the door, not presuming to move further into the space, looking around with evident surprise at what he saw. The cottage was nothing like the house where Marcus had grown up. Gone were the expensive furnishings his late mother Helen had chosen, the elaborate decorations, the sense of trying to impress visitors. This place was simple but warm, every piece of furniture clearly handmade, every detail speaking to function over form. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on woodworking, local history, and the philosophy texts Frank had discovered in his later years. The kitchen was small but efficient, dominated by a farmhouse table that could seat 6. "This is nice," Marcus said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Did you build all this yourself?" "Most of it." Frank moved to the kitchen and put a kettle on the stove, muscle memory taking over while his mind processed the surreal nature of the situation. "There are towels in the bathroom, first door on the left. You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Marcus nodded gratefully and disappeared down the short hallway. Frank heard the bathroom door close and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands shook slightly as he reached for 2 mugs from the cabinet, one his usual blue ceramic cup, the other a spare he'd never expected to need. Through the bathroom door, he could hear Marcus moving around, and Frank found himself remembering other times his son had been in his home, sick or troubled, or just needing comfort. When Marcus was 8 and had caught the flu that kept him home from school for a week, Frank had made him countless cups of hot tea with honey. When he was 16 and had been dumped by his first serious girlfriend, he'd sat at Frank's kitchen table until 2 in the morning, talking through his heartbreak while Frank listened and offered what wisdom he could. When Helen died 5 years ago, Marcus had stayed with Frank for 3 weeks, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, both of them navigating their grief together. Frank had thought then that tragedy would bring them closer, that losing Helen would make them cherish what family they had left. He'd been wrong. The bathroom door opened, and Marcus emerged wearing one of Frank's old work shirts and a pair of sweatpants that were too big for him. Frank's son had always been lean, but now he looked gaunt, as if he'd lost significant weight. The borrowed clothes hung on his frame like he was a teenager again, trying on his father's things. "Thanks," Marcus said, settling carefully at the kitchen table. Frank set a steaming mug of tea in front of him and took the seat across from his son, the same position they'd occupied countless times over the years, though never under circumstances quite like these. "You look like hell," Frank said bluntly. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation delivered with the straightforward honesty that came with age and experience. Marcus wrapped his hands around the mug, seeking warmth. "I feel like hell," he admitted. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you, something I need to ask you." Frank waited, studying his son's face. Marcus had inherited Helen's delicate features and dark eyes, but right now those eyes held a desperate quality that Frank had never seen before. Whatever had brought Marcus to his door in the middle of a mountain rainstorm, it wasn't good news. "I lost my job," Marcus said finally. 3 months ago. The company downsized and my position was eliminated. I thought I'd find something else quickly. I had a good track record, contacts in the industry, but nothing materialized. Then Sarah and I—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah. Frank remembered meeting her exactly once, at Marcus's wedding 2 years ago. A polished woman in her early 30s with an MBA and opinions about everything, including Frank's place in her new husband's life. She'd been polite but cool, making it clear that she viewed Frank as a relic from Marcus's past that needed to be managed rather than embraced. "Sarah left me," Marcus continued, his voice barely audible. "Last month. She said she didn't sign up to be married to someone who couldn't provide the lifestyle she expected. She took half of everything, including the house. I've been staying in hotels, then cheap motels, and now—" He gestured vaguely at his appearance. "Now I'm here." Frank sipped his tea, processing this information. Part of him, the part that had spent 3 years nursing hurt and resentment, felt a flicker of vindication. The son who had chosen his wife's comfort over his father's dignity was now learning what it felt like to be discarded when times got tough. But the larger part of him, the part that remembered teaching Marcus to ride a bike and helping him with algebra homework, felt only sadness for his child's pain. "I'm sorry to hear that," Frank said, and meant it. "Losing a job, a marriage, that's a lot to handle at once." Marcus looked up from his tea, hope flickering in his eyes. "Dad, I know I have no right to ask this. I know what I did to you was unforgivable. But I'm desperate. I've looked into apartments, but without a job, no one will rent to me. I've applied for dozens of positions, but the market is tight, and I'm competing with people half my age who'll work for half the salary." Frank knew where this was heading, but he let Marcus continue. "I saw online that you have a guest house on your property," Marcus said, the words coming faster now, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. "I was wondering, hoping, if maybe I could stay there for a little while, just until I get back on my feet. I wouldn't bother you, wouldn't expect you to take care of me. I just need a roof over my head while I figure things out." The guest house. Frank had built it 2 years ago, originally intending to rent it out for extra income. It was a small but complete living space, bedroom, kitchenette, bathroom, sitting area, located about 50 yards from the main cottage. He'd listed it on various rental platforms, but had found he preferred his privacy to the modest income it might generate. For the past year, it had sat empty except for the occasional weekend guest. "You want to stay in my guest house," Frank repeated slowly. "For free?" "I would pay you as soon as I can," Marcus said quickly. "I have some savings left, but I need to be careful with it, and I promise I wouldn't be a burden. You'd barely know I was there." Frank set down his mug and looked at his son, really looked at him. Beneath the desperation and the pride swallowing humility, he could see the boy Marcus had once been, the child who had followed Frank around construction sites during summer breaks, eager to learn how things were built. The teenager who had proudly shown Frank his first paycheck from his part-time job at the hardware store. The young man who had called Frank every Sunday during his first year of college, homesick and needing to hear his father's voice. Where had that young man gone? When had he become someone who could throw his own father out of the family home because it was convenient for his new wife? "You know what's funny?" Frank said, his voice carrying no humor. 3 years ago, when you told me I needed to find somewhere else to live, you said it was because Sarah felt uncomfortable having me around. You said I was in the way of your new life together. Marcus flinched, as if Frank had struck him. "Dad, I'm not finished." Frank's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "You gave me 30 days to uproot my entire life. 30 days to find a place to live. To figure out how to move 3 decades worth of belongings, to start over at 60 years old. Do you remember what you said when I asked if I could stay just a few more weeks to get my affairs in order?" Marcus's face had gone pale. "Dad, please." "You said no. You said Sarah needed to feel comfortable in her own home, and my presence was preventing that. You stood in the living room of the house I'd spent 20 years paying for, the house where I'd raised you and your mother had died, and you told me that your wife's comfort was more important than your father's well-being." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 3 years of unspoken pain. Marcus stared down at his hands, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I was so wrong, Dad. I knew it even then, but Sarah kept pushing, and I thought I had to choose between you and my marriage. I thought if I didn't support her completely, I'd lose her." "And how did that work out for you?" Frank asked, not unkindly, but without mercy either. Marcus's shoulders began to shake, and Frank realized his son was crying, Not the angry tears of a confrontation, but the broken sobs of someone who had lost everything that mattered and finally understood the full cost of his choices. "I lost her anyway," Marcus said through his tears. "And I lost you. And I lost myself somewhere along the way. I became someone I don't recognize, someone who would hurt the person who loved him most in service of someone who never really loved him at all." Frank watched his son cry, feeling the familiar tug of paternal instinct warring with the memory of his own pain. For 3 years he'd imagined this moment, Marcus returning, asking for forgiveness, acknowledging the harm he'd caused. In some versions of this fantasy, Frank had been magnanimous, quick to forgive and forget. In others, he'd turned his son away without a second thought, finally evening the scales of hurt. But reality, as always, was more complicated than fantasy. Sitting across from his broken child, Frank found he felt neither vindicated nor generous. He felt tired and sad and uncertain about what came next. "The guest house," Frank said finally, "has been empty for a year. It's clean, furnished, everything you'd need for basic living, running water, electricity, heat, small but adequate." Marcus looked up, hope and fear battling in his expression. "If you stay there," Frank continued, "there would be conditions, rules. This isn't the same as moving back into your childhood bedroom. We're both different people now, and we have a lot of damage to sort through." "Anything," Marcus said quickly. "Whatever you think is fair." Frank stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain that continued to fall steadily on his 2 acres of carefully maintained property. The guest house was barely visible through the trees, a small structure that represented both sanctuary and exile, depending on your perspective. "I need to think about this," Frank said. "It's been 3 years, Marcus. 3 years of building a life without you in it. You can't just show up on my doorstep and expect everything to go back to the way it was." "I don't expect that," Marcus said. "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. But, Dad, I'm at the end of my rope. I have nowhere else to go." Frank turned back to face his son, seeing in his features an echo of the little boy who used to crawl into bed with Frank and Helen during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and safety in his parents' presence. But he also saw the man who had chosen duty to a wife over loyalty to a father, who had been willing to sacrifice decades of family bonds for the sake of domestic peace. "You can stay tonight," Frank said finally, "in the guest house. Tomorrow, when the rain stops and we can both think clearly, we'll talk about whether this arrangement might work for both of us." The relief on Marcus's face was immediate and overwhelming. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you, Dad." "I know I don't deserve—" "No," Frank interrupted gently, "you don't deserve it, but that's not why I'm offering. I'm offering because you're my son, and despite everything that's happened between us, that still means something to me. Whether it's enough to build on, well, we'll have to see." Frank retrieved a set of keys from a drawer in the kitchen and handed them to Marcus. "The guest house is the path through those trees. Can't miss it. There's firewood stacked on the side, food basics in the pantry. Make yourself at home for tonight." Marcus stood up, clutching the keys like a lifeline. He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to his father. "Dad, I really am sorry. For all of it. I know saying it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know." Frank nodded. "I know you are, son. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out what comes next." After Marcus left, Frank stood alone in his cottage, listening to the rain and trying to process what had just happened. 3 years of carefully constructed independence, 3 years of learning to live without his son's presence in his life, and now Marcus was back, broken and desperate, and sleeping 50 yards away. Frank walked back to his workshop, but found he couldn't concentrate on the cherry wood table that had been absorbing his attention all afternoon. Instead, he sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace and stared into the flames, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if he'd finally been given the chance to heal a wound that had never properly closed. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the mountains clean and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next. Frank woke before dawn, as had been his habit for the past 3 years. The cottage was silent, except for the steady tick of the mantel clock and the soft whisper of dying embers in the fireplace. Through his bedroom window, he could see that the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside, washed clean and gleaming under the pale light of early morning. He made coffee in the quiet kitchen, grinding the beans by hand as he always did, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. The rich aroma filled the small space, mixing with the lingering scent of wood smoke and the faint smell of sawdust that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. Frank had always been an early riser, but since moving to the mountains, these pre-dawn hours had become sacred time, a chance to plan his day, to reflect on his projects, to exist in perfect solitude before the world demanded his attention. This morning, however, solitude felt different. 50 yards away, his son was sleeping in the guest house, and Frank found himself hyper-aware of that presence in a way that surprised him. He'd thought he'd made peace with Marcus's absence from his life, but now he realized that making peace and moving on were two entirely different things. Frank carried his coffee to the front porch, wrapping his hands around the warm mug as he settled into the wooden rocking chair he'd built from hickory, salvaged from a tree that had fallen on his property during his first winter here. The morning air was crisp with the promise of a beautiful October day, the kind of weather that made the North Carolina mountains feel like the closest thing to paradise on earth. Through the trees, he could see a thin line of smoke rising from the guest house chimney. Marcus was awake too, probably making his own coffee in the small kitchenette Frank had equipped with basic necessities. Frank wondered what his son was thinking this morning, whether he was having second thoughts about showing up here, whether he truly understood the complexity of what he was asking for. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted Frank's thoughts. Marcus emerged from the tree line, walking slowly up the path that led to the main cottage. He'd found some of Frank's old work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that hung loose on his diminished frame, and his hair was damp from what must have been a quick shower. In the morning light, the toll of recent months was even more apparent. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and there was a tentative quality to his movements, as if he wasn't sure he belonged anywhere. "Morning, Dad," Marcus said, as he approached the porch, his voice carefully neutral. "I hope it's okay that I came up. I wanted to thank you again for last night." Frank gestured to the second rocking chair on the porch, a companion piece to his own, that he'd built on a whim but rarely used. "Sit," he said simply. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "That sounds good," Marcus said, settling into the chair with visible relief. Frank went inside and returned with another mug, handing it to his son before resuming his own seat. They sat in silence for several minutes, both men sipping their coffee and watching the sun gradually illuminate the valley below. The view from Frank's porch was spectacular. Rolling hills covered in hardwood forests that exploded with color every autumn, distant peaks that caught the first light of day, the sense of being above the world's troubles while still being part of its beauty. "This is incredible," Marcus said finally. "I had no idea places like this existed so close to Charlotte." "It's about an hour and a half from your old neighborhood," Frank said, "but it might as well be a different planet." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "How did you find it? This place, I mean." Frank set down his mug and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight. "After you asked me to move out, I spent about 2 weeks feeling sorry for myself in a motel room in Gastonia, eating fast food, watching too much television, generally wallowing in self-pity. Then one morning I woke up and realized I had a choice. I could spend whatever years I have left being bitter about what I'd lost, or I could use this as an opportunity to build something new. So you just started over? Not just. It took months to find this place. Months more to make it livable. The cottage was a shell when I bought it. Roof leaked, plumbing was shot, electrical system was held together with prayers and electrical tape. But it had good bones, and the land. Frank gestured toward the view. Well, you can see what the land offered. Marcus followed his father's gaze across the valley, taking in the scope of what Frank had accomplished. You did all the renovation yourself? Most of it. Hired professionals for some of the electrical work and the new septic system, but everything else I figured out as I went along. YouTube University, library books, trial and error. Turns out 38 years in construction teaches you more than you realize. It's beautiful, Marcus said, and Frank could hear genuine admiration in his voice. I never knew you wanted to live like this. Frank considered that statement, recognizing the truth in it. I didn't know either, honestly. For 20 years, your mother and I lived in that suburban house, following the script we thought we were supposed to follow. Nice neighborhood, good schools, keeping up with the Joneses. It wasn't until I lost all of that I discovered what I actually wanted was something simpler, more authentic. Do you miss it? The old life? Frank was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Helen's carefully decorated living room, the sound of Marcus's laughter echoing through the hallways during his teenage years, the sense of belonging to a community of neighbors and friends. I miss your mother every day, he said finally, and I miss the version of you that used to call every Sunday, just to talk. But the rest of it, the house, the obligations, the constant pressure to appear successful, no. I don't miss that at all. Marcus flinched at the reference to their lost relationship, but didn't look away. I stopped calling because Sarah thought it was clingy. She said successful men don't need to check in with their parents constantly. And you agreed with her? I thought I did, or maybe I convinced myself I did because it was easier than fighting about it. But then Marcus turned to face his father directly. Dad, I know this doesn't excuse anything, but I want you to understand. Sarah had very specific ideas about how our life should look, the kind of house we should live in, the kind of people we should socialize with, how we should spend our time and money. When you were living with us after Mom died, she felt like your presence disrupted her vision of our perfect life. Frank felt anger stirring in his chest, but it was different from the sharp rage he'd carried for 3 years. This was a deeper, sadder emotion, disappointment in choices made and roads not taken. So you chose her vision over your family, Frank said. You decided that her comfort was worth more than my dignity. Yes, Marcus said simply. And it was the worst decision I've ever made. Not just because of how things turned out with Sarah, but because of what I lost with you. I threw away the most important relationship in my life for someone who left the moment things got difficult. Frank studied his son's profile as Marcus stared out at the mountains. The resemblance to Helen was strong in the morning light, the shape of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders when he was thinking hard about something. But there was something new in Marcus's expression, a quality Frank hadn't seen before. Humility, perhaps. Or the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from losing everything you thought you couldn't live without. Tell me about the job, Frank said. What happened? Marcus sighed, running his hands through his hair. The company was restructuring, cutting costs wherever they could. I was making good money, probably too good for what I actually contributed. When they started laying people off, I figured my track record would protect me. I'd been there 8 years, had good performance reviews, brought in solid clients. But they could hire 2 recent college graduates for what they were paying me. And in a down market, experience matters less than cost efficiency. Marcus's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had learned painful lessons about his own expendability. The severance package was decent, but not enough to maintain our lifestyle for very long. Sarah started panicking almost immediately. How did she react when you told her you'd lost the job? Marcus was quiet for so long that Frank thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She asked me how quickly I could find something else. When I said it might take a few months, she started crying. Not because she was sad or worried about our future together, but because she was angry that I'd disrupted her plans. We were supposed to buy a bigger house that spring, supposed to take a vacation to Europe that summer. My unemployment meant those things weren't possible anymore. Frank felt a familiar protective instinct rise up, the same feeling he'd had when Marcus was a child and other kids picked on him at school. But this time, the person who had hurt his son was someone Marcus had chosen, someone he'd prioritized over his own father. And when you couldn't find another job right away? She got meaner. Started making comments about my age, about how the job market had passed me by, about how embarrassing it was to explain to her friends why her husband was unemployed. She'd compare me to her friends' husbands who were still climbing the corporate ladder, still bringing home bigger paychecks every year. That must have been hard to hear. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was devastating. But you know what the worst part was? I started believing her. I started thinking that maybe I was washed up, that maybe I was a failure as a provider and a husband. It never occurred to me that a woman who claimed to love me might show some compassion during the worst period of my professional life. Frank set down his coffee mug and really looked at his son, not the successful businessman Marcus had been, not the child he'd once been, but the man he was right now. Broken, humbled, but perhaps for the first time in years honest about his own failures and the failures of others. When did she leave? About 6 weeks ago. She'd been staying at her sister's more and more often, claiming she needed space to think. Then one day I came home and half the furniture was gone. She'd hired movers while I was out job hunting, left a note saying she couldn't waste any more of her life waiting for me to become the man she'd married. The man she'd married, Frank repeated. You mean the man with money and status? Exactly. It became clear that she'd never actually loved me. She'd loved what I represented. The lifestyle I could provide, the image we projected as a couple, the security of being married to someone with a good job and a bright future. When all of that disappeared, there was nothing left. Frank stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the property he'd built from nothing. Every fence post, every flower bed, every carefully maintained path represented hours of work, years of dedication to creating something meaningful from raw materials. It occurred to him that rebuilding a life was not unlike rebuilding a house. You had to clear away what was damaged beyond repair before you could lay a new foundation. So now what? Frank asked, turning back to face his son. You've lost your job, your wife, your house. You're starting over at 35, with nothing but the clothes on your back and a father you treated badly. What's your plan? Marcus met his gaze steadily. I don't have a plan, Dad. Not a real one. I'm applying for jobs, but the market is brutal, and I'm competing with people who are younger, cheaper, more desperate than I am. I've got maybe 3 months of expenses saved up if I'm very careful with money. After that, he shrugged. I honestly don't know. And you think staying in my guest house is going to solve these problems? No, Marcus said quickly. I think staying in your guest house might give me time to figure out solutions to these problems. A stable place to live while I job hunt, a chance to get my feet under me without worrying about rent I can't afford. And maybe... He hesitated, as if afraid to voice the next part. Maybe a chance to repair the relationship I care about most. Frank studied his son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or false sentiment, but all he saw was exhaustion, desperation, and what appeared to be genuine regret. Marcus had always been an honest child, sometimes brutally so. It was only in adulthood that he'd learned to shade the truth, to prioritize diplomacy over authenticity. This version of his son, stripped of pretense and professional polish, reminded Frank of the boy he'd raised. "If you stay here," Frank said slowly, "it won't be as my guest, it'll be as my tenant. I'll charge you rent, not market rate, but enough that you're contributing to your own upkeep. You'll be responsible for maintaining the guest house, for grocery shopping and cooking your own meals, for finding your own transportation when you need it." Marcus nodded eagerly. "Of course. I wouldn't expect. I'm not finished." Frank's voice carried the authority of a man who had spent decades managing construction crews. "You'll also contribute to the maintenance of this property. I've got a long list of projects that need doing, and I'm not as young as I used to be. If you're going to live here, you're going to earn your keep." "I'd welcome the chance to help," Marcus said. "I've been sitting around feeling useless for months. Having something productive to do would be good for me." Frank walked back to his chair and sat down, considering his next words carefully. "The hardest part won't be the work or the rent or the practical arrangements. The hardest part will be figuring out how to be father and son again after everything that's happened between us." Marcus's eyes filled with tears he was trying hard not to shed. "Do you think that's possible, after what I did?" Frank looked out over the valley one more time, thinking about the years of work it had taken to transform this raw land into something beautiful and functional. Some projects required demolition before reconstruction could begin. Others just needed patient, steady effort applied over time. "I don't know," Frank said honestly, "but I'm willing to try if you are. It won't be easy and it won't be quick. Trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt from the ground up, but you're still my son, and I'm still your father. Maybe that's enough to start with." Marcus couldn't hold back the tears anymore. "Thank you," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I promise I'll do whatever it takes to prove I've learned from my mistakes." Frank reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder, the first physical contact they'd had in 3 years. "We'll see," he said. "One day at a time." As the sun rose higher over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and green, both men sat quietly, each contemplating the long road ahead. Frank thought about the projects they could work on together, the conversations they needed to have, the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by pride and poor choices. Marcus thought about the chance he'd been given, not just for shelter and stability, but for redemption. Neither man knew if this arrangement would work. Too much damage had been done, too many hurtful words spoken, too much time lost. But sometimes, Frank reflected, hope was enough to begin with. Sometimes the willingness to try was the first step toward healing wounds that seemed beyond repair. The morning was full of possibilities, and for the first time in months, Marcus dared to believe that his story might not end in complete failure. And for the first time in 3 years, Frank allowed himself to hope that his family might not be irreparably broken after all. 2 weeks into Marcus's stay, Frank established a routine that helped both men navigate the awkward territory of their renewed relationship. Each morning they met on the main cottage's front porch for coffee, sharing the weather forecast and discussing the day's planned projects. The conversations were initially stilted. 2 men who had once known each other intimately, learning to communicate again across a chasm of hurt and disappointment. Marcus proved to be a more willing worker than Frank had expected. Despite his years in corporate offices, he still remembered the basic construction skills Frank had taught him during summer breaks from high school. His hands quickly recalled the feel of tools, the rhythm of physical labor, the satisfaction that came from building something tangible and useful. Their first major project together was repairing the stone retaining wall that bordered Frank's driveway. Heavy rains the previous spring had undermined the foundation, causing a 30-foot section to buckle and lean dangerously outward. Frank had been putting off the repair because it was a two-person job, and hiring help would have meant bringing strangers onto his carefully maintained sanctuary. Working side by side, they dismantled the damaged section, stone by stone, Frank teaching Marcus the proper technique for evaluating which stones could be reused and which needed to be replaced. The work was methodical and demanding, requiring them to communicate constantly about weight distribution, placement, and the subtle art of fitting irregular stones together into a structure that would last for decades. "Masonry is like life," Frank said on the third day of the project, as they positioned a particularly challenging cornerstone. "You can't rush it, and every piece has to support the pieces around it. One weak link, and the whole thing eventually falls apart." Marcus paused in his work, understanding that his father was talking about more than just stones. "Is that what happened to our family? One weak link?" Frank considered the question as he used a small hammer to chip away an irregular edge. "I think it was more complicated than that. Your mother's death created cracks in our foundation that we never properly addressed. When you married Sarah, instead of reinforcing what we had, you chose to build something entirely new, leaving the old structure to crumble. I thought I was protecting what I was building with Sarah by keeping it separate from everything else," Marcus said quietly. "I thought compartmentalizing my life would make everything simpler." "But relationships don't work that way," Frank replied. "Family isn't something you can turn on and off when it's convenient. It's supposed to be the bedrock everything else is built on." As they worked, Marcus began to share details about his marriage that he'd never discussed with anyone. How Sarah had gradually isolated him from his friends, claiming they weren't the right kind of people for someone with his aspirations. How she'd criticized his casual clothes, his modest car, his preference for quiet evenings at home over elaborate social events. How she'd made him feel that everything about his previous life, including his relationship with his father, was somehow inadequate or embarrassing. "I started seeing myself through her eyes," Marcus admitted, as they mixed mortar for the reconstructed wall. "She had such clear ideas about success, about how successful people lived and behaved. I began to believe that maybe my old life had been small and ordinary, that I needed to leave it behind to become the man she wanted me to be." Frank paused in his mixing, the paddle still in his hands. "And what kind of man did she want you to be?" "Someone who could provide the lifestyle she'd grown up with. Her father was a surgeon, very successful, very focused on appearances and status. Their family vacationed in Europe every summer, drove luxury cars, lived in a house that looked like something from a magazine. She expected marriage to maintain that standard of living, if not improve on it. Did you want those things too?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, carefully considering his answer. "I thought I did. The money was nice, being able to buy whatever we wanted without worrying about the cost. But the rest of it, the pressure to always be on, to constantly prove our success to other people, to measure everything by how it looked to outsiders, it was exhausting. But you went along with it. I went along with it because I thought that's what love required. Sarah seemed so certain about everything, so confident in her vision of our future. I convinced myself that my doubts were just fear of change, that I needed to trust her judgment about what would make us happy." Frank resumed mixing the mortar, his movements steady and practiced. "Your mother and I had a very different approach to marriage. We made decisions together, compromised when we disagreed, supported each other's dreams even when they weren't our own dreams. It never occurred to me that love could be conditional on meeting someone else's expectations. I know that now, Marcus said. Watching Sarah walk away the moment things got difficult showed me what conditional love looks like. But at the time, I was so caught up in trying to be worthy of her that I lost sight of who I actually was. By the end of the week, they had rebuilt the retaining wall, creating a structure that was actually stronger than the original. Frank stepped back to admire their work, noting how the new mortar joints were cleaner and more precise than what had been there before. "Good work," he said, and Marcus beamed at the praise like a teenager who had just been told he'd passed his driving test. "It feels good to build something," Marcus said. "I'd forgotten how satisfying physical work could be. At my old job, everything was abstract: financial projections, market analyses, presentations that disappeared into computer files. This," he gestured at the wall, "this will be here long after we're gone." Frank nodded, understanding the appeal of permanent creation over temporary achievement. "That's part of why I love this place. Every improvement I make is something real, something that enhances the land instead of just extracting value from it." Their success with the retaining wall led to more ambitious projects. They rebuilt the front steps of the guest house, replaced a section of split-rail fencing, and began planning a new workshop where Marcus could set up his own workspace. Each project provided opportunities for conversation, for sharing stories, for the gradual rebuilding of trust between them. Marcus proved to be a thoughtful listener, asking questions about Frank's life that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. He wanted to know about the books Frank had been reading, the neighbors he'd befriended, the small routines and rituals that had given shape to his mountain existence. In return, Frank found himself curious about Marcus's inner life in ways he hadn't been during his son's marriage. What Marcus thought about during his long job search, what he'd learned about himself during his months of unemployment, what kind of future he was hoping to build. "I used to think success meant climbing a ladder," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley. "Getting promoted, making more money, achieving higher status. But that's not really success, is it? That's just progression. Success should be about becoming the person you're meant to be, not about impressing other people." "What kind of person do you think you're meant to be?" Frank asked. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to deep indigo. "Someone who builds things that last, someone who keeps his word, someone who values relationships over achievements, someone like you, actually." Frank felt a complex mix of emotions at those words: pride, gratification, and a deep sadness for all the years they'd lost to misunderstanding and misdirected priorities. "I'm not perfect, son," Frank said gently. "I made plenty of mistakes raising you and your mother. I probably worked too much when you were young, probably didn't communicate as well as I should have. The difference is that I learned from my mistakes instead of repeating them." "What's the biggest mistake you think you made with me?" Frank considered the question carefully. "I think I did too good a job providing for you and your mother. You never had to struggle for anything important, never had to develop resilience or resourcefulness. When life got difficult after your mother died, you didn't have the tools to handle adversity, so you let someone else make the hard decisions for you. You think I was spoiled? I think you were protected. There's a difference, but the end result was the same. You reached adulthood without learning that love sometimes requires difficult choices, that doing the right thing isn't always convenient or comfortable." Marcus absorbed this criticism without defensiveness, a change Frank noted with approval. 3 years ago, any suggestion that Marcus had been lacking in character would have triggered an angry argument. Now, he seemed capable of examining his own shortcomings with honesty and even gratitude for the insight. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the gravel driveway. Frank rarely received visitors, especially in the evening, and both men looked toward the approaching headlights with curiosity. A silver SUV pulled up to the cottage, and Frank recognized it immediately. "That's the Hendersons," Frank said, standing up. "My neighbors from down the road." "Wonder what brings them up here?" Tom and Betty Henderson emerged from their vehicle, both in their early 70s and clearly agitated about something. Frank had grown fond of the Hendersons over the past 3 years. They were retired teachers who had moved to the mountains for the same reasons Frank had, seeking simplicity and natural beauty after decades of urban complexity. "Frank," Tom called out as they approached the porch. "We're sorry to bother you so late, but we need to talk to you about something important." "Of course," Frank said, gesturing for them to join him and Marcus on the porch. "Tom, Betty, this is my son Marcus. Marcus, these are my neighbors, the Hendersons." Marcus stood and shook hands with both visitors, his corporate training in social pleasantries still intact, despite his recent troubles. But Frank could see the tension in the older couple's faces, the way they exchanged meaningful glances that suggested serious business. "What's going on?" Frank asked. Betty Henderson, normally a cheerful woman who delighted in sharing garden vegetables and local gossip, looked uncharacteristically grim. "Frank, we got a call this afternoon from a real estate developer, someone named Peterson. He said he's been buying up property in this area and wanted to make us an offer on our land." Frank felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of offer?" "3 times what we paid for it," Tom said. "Cash, quick closing. No inspections or contingencies. He said he's planning to develop the whole valley. Luxury vacation homes, a golf course, spa resort. He mentioned specifically that he'd already spoken to several other landowners and expected to have most of the valley under contract within the next few months." "Did he mention my property?" Betty nodded grimly. "He said you'd be receiving a call soon, probably tomorrow. Frank, this man seemed very confident that everyone would sell. He kept talking about how difficult it was to maintain these mountain properties, how much cheaper it would be to take his money and move somewhere more convenient." Frank sank back into his rocking chair, feeling like the solid ground beneath his feet had suddenly become unstable. This cottage, this land, the life he'd built here, it wasn't just his home anymore, it was his identity. The idea of bulldozers and construction crews destroying the peace he'd worked so hard to create was almost unbearable. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked the Hendersons. Tom and Betty exchanged another look. "We're not sure," Tom admitted. "The money is tempting. It would more than pay for a nice place closer to our kids, maybe something with less maintenance and better access to medical care. At our age, the practical advantages are hard to ignore." "But this is our home," Betty added quickly. "We love this valley, this community. The idea of watching it turned into some kind of luxury playground for wealthy people. It breaks our heart." Frank understood their dilemma completely. The mountains attracted many people precisely because they offered an escape from development and commercialization. But that same pristine quality made them attractive to developers who specialized in selling natural beauty to clients who could afford to purchase it by the acre. "Have you talked to any of the other landowners?" Frank asked. "A few," Tom said. "The Johnsons down by the creek are definitely selling. They've been wanting to move closer to their grandchildren anyway. The family that owns the old farm on the ridge seems interested. That young couple with the organic vegetable business is holding out, but they're struggling financially. If the developer offers enough money..." The implications were clear. If enough landowners sold, the entire character of the valley would change. Even those who held out would find themselves surrounded by construction, traffic, and the kind of wealthy tourists who viewed rural communities as entertainment rather than home. "Frank," Betty said quietly, "Tom and I wanted to ask you, are you planning to sell?" Frank looked out over the valley that had become his sanctuary, then at his son sitting beside him, then at his neighbors who had become his chosen family. The cottage behind him represented 3 years of his life, thousands of hours of work, the slow and careful construction of a new identity after losing everything he'd thought mattered. "No," he said firmly, "I'm not selling. This is my home." The relief on the Hendersons' faces was immediate and profound. "Thank you," Betty said, tears in her eyes. "Knowing you're staying makes our decision easier. We're not selling either." After the Hendersons left, Frank and Marcus sat in silence on the porch, both men processing the implications of what they'd learned. The peaceful valley that had seemed so permanent and protected now felt fragile, vulnerable to forces beyond their control. "Dad," Marcus said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. If I hadn't shown up when I did, would you have considered selling?" Frank thought about the question seriously. A few months ago, maybe. It would have been a lot of money, enough to buy a place anywhere I wanted, and there's something to be said for financial security at my age. "What changed your mind?" Frank looked at his son, seeing in his face the boy who had once helped him build a treehouse in their backyard, the teenager who had spent summer afternoons learning to use power tools, the young man who had called him every Sunday just to talk. "You did," Frank said simply. "Having you here reminded me that some things are worth more than money. This place isn't just a house on some land. It's a foundation for rebuilding our relationship. It's a place where we can work together, where we can figure out how to be father and son again. You can't put a price on that." Marcus felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the generosity of his father's love and the magnitude of what he'd almost thrown away permanently. "I want to help you fight this," Marcus said, "whatever it takes to protect this place, this valley. I don't have much to offer right now, but I can research property law, help organize the neighbors, do whatever needs doing." Frank smiled, recognizing in his son's words the commitment and loyalty he'd been hoping to see. "I'd like that," he said. "We'll need all the help we can get." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, both men understood that they were facing more than just a business challenge. This was a test of everything they'd been rebuilding: their relationship, their shared values, their commitment to something larger than individual interests. The developer who wanted to buy their land was really asking them to put a price on home, on family, on the things that couldn't be replaced once they were sold. Frank reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "Welcome home, Marcus," he said. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus truly felt like he was. The call came at 8 o'clock the next morning, just as Frank and Marcus were finishing their coffee on the front porch. Frank's phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and when he answered, a smooth, confident voice introduced itself as Richard Peterson from Mountain Vista Development Group. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you'll forgive the early call, but I wanted to reach you before my schedule gets too busy today. I believe your neighbors, the Hendersons, may have mentioned our conversation yesterday." Frank kept his voice neutral. "They did. Excellent. Then you know why I'm calling. Mr. Morrison, I'm prepared to make you an offer that I think you'll find very attractive. I've had your property appraised, and I'm willing to pay 4 times the current market value. Cash, 30-day closing, and we'll handle all the paperwork and moving expenses. 4 times market value." Frank did quick mental math and realized Peterson was talking about enough money to buy a house anywhere in the country, enough to ensure comfortable retirement without any financial worries. It was the kind of offer that would have seemed like a miracle just a few years ago. "That's generous," Frank said carefully. "Can I ask what you're planning to do with the property?" "Of course. Mountain Vista specializes in luxury eco-resorts that blend seamlessly with the natural environment. We're planning a small, exclusive development, Maybe 50 custom homes, a championship golf course, spa facilities, hiking trails. The kind of place where successful people can escape the stress of modern life and reconnect with nature. Marcus was listening intently, his expression growing darker with each detail Peterson shared. Frank could see his son's jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists. "And this development would require the entire valley?" Frank asked. "Eventually, yes. We've found that guests expect a certain level of privacy and exclusivity. Having existing residential properties scattered throughout the area would detract from the experience we're trying to create." Frank felt his own anger rising, but he kept his voice steady. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in selling." There was a pause, and when Peterson spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, still polite, but with an edge of impatience underneath. "Mr. Morrison, I understand that leaving a home can be emotional, but I hope you'll consider the practical benefits of my offer. Properties like yours require constant maintenance, and as we get older, that becomes more challenging. Plus, you'd be financially set for life. Most people would call that a win-win situation." "Most people aren't me," Frank said firmly. "This is my home, Mr. Peterson. It's not for sale." "I see." Peterson's voice became more businesslike. "Well, I hope you'll take some time to think about it. I'll be in the area for the next few weeks, and my offer will remain open. Sometimes people change their minds once they've had a chance to really consider all the implications." "What implications are those?" "Well, development is going to happen in this valley one way or another, Mr. Morrison. I've got contracts pending on about 60% of the available land already. Once construction begins, the area is going to change dramatically. Increased traffic, noise, disruption. Some people find it's easier to sell before that process starts, rather than after." Frank felt a chill at the subtle threat in Peterson's words. "Are you saying my life here will become unpleasant if I don't sell?" "Not at all," Peterson said smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out that change is inevitable, and it's usually better to be part of that change than to fight against it. But as I said, my offer remains open. Have a good day, Mr. Morrison." After Peterson hung up, Frank and Marcus sat in silence for several minutes. The morning that had started so peacefully now felt charged with tension and uncertainty. "4 times market value," Marcus said finally. "Dad, that's an incredible amount of money." Frank looked at his son sharply, afraid of what he might be suggesting. "I'm not saying you should take it," Marcus added quickly. "I'm just saying this Peterson guy clearly has serious financial backing. He's not going to give up easily." "Good," Frank said. "Neither am I." Over the next week, they learned just how serious Peterson was about acquiring the valley. He hosted a presentation at the local community center, complete with architectural renderings and economic projections, showing how the development would benefit the region. The images were beautiful. Elegant homes nestled discreetly among the trees, a golf course that followed the natural contours of the land, spa buildings designed to look like they had grown organically from the mountainside. But Frank knew the reality would be different. He'd worked enough construction jobs to understand that no development project ever looked like the artist's renderings. There would be clear-cutting, grading, infrastructure installation that would permanently alter the ecosystem of the valley. The 50 custom homes Peterson mentioned would require roads, utilities, waste management systems, and all the supporting infrastructure that came with bringing city amenities to rural areas. Marcus threw himself into researching Peterson and Mountain Vista Development Group. Using skills he'd developed during his corporate career, he traced the company's previous projects, studied their financial backing, and investigated their methods of acquiring land for development. "Dad, you need to see this," Marcus said one evening, spreading printouts across Frank's kitchen table. "Peterson's done this exact same thing in 3 other locations over the past 5 years. Small mountain communities, similar demographics, same approach, massive cash offers, promises of eco-friendly development, followed by projects that completely transformed the character of the areas. Frank studied the photographs Marcus had found online. Before and after shots of valleys that had once looked much like theirs, now dominated by golf courses, clubhouses, and rows of identical luxury homes that looked nothing like the architectural renderings that had been used to sell the projects to local communities. What happened to the people who refused to sell? Frank asked. That's the interesting part, Marcus said, pulling out more documents. In every case, Peterson eventually got the holdouts to sell. Sometimes through repeated offers with higher dollar amounts, sometimes by making their lives difficult during construction, blocking access roads, creating noise and dust problems, cutting off utilities that ran across properties he controlled. And that's legal? Technically, yes. If he owns the surrounding properties, he can control access easements, utility rights-of-way, and other infrastructure. He can make it very expensive and inconvenient for holdouts to maintain their properties. Lo, Frank felt a familiar anger rising. The same feeling he'd had when younger men on construction sites had tried to intimidate him, when corporate executives had attempted to shortchange his crews on payment. It was the anger of someone who had worked hard for everything he owned, being threatened by someone who viewed that work as an obstacle to profit. Then we need to make sure he doesn't get the surrounding properties, Frank said. How many landowners are we talking about? Marcus consulted his notes. 15 families own land in the valley. The Hendersons are with us. That couple with the organic farm, the Washingtons, they seem committed to staying. But the others? He shrugged. Some are elderly and genuinely attracted to the idea of cashing out. Others are struggling financially and see this as their only chance to get ahead. A few seem genuinely torn between the money and their attachment to the land. What do you think our chances are? Honestly, not great if we're just asking people to turn down life-changing amounts of money out of sentiment. But Peterson has weaknesses. His timeline is aggressive. He needs to complete acquisitions quickly to satisfy his investors. His previous projects took longer and cost more than originally projected. And he's not from here. He doesn't understand the community dynamics that might work against him. Frank smiled, recognizing in his son's analysis the same methodical approach to problem-solving that had made him successful in business. Marcus was applying those skills to something that mattered, something worth fighting for. What do you suggest? We organize. We research the legal obstacles he'll face, the environmental impact studies required, the permitting process that could slow him down. We help our neighbors understand what they're really giving up, not just what they're gaining. And we find ways to make it more expensive and time-consuming for him to develop here than he originally planned. Over the following weeks, Frank and Marcus became the unofficial leaders of a grassroots resistance movement. They organized meetings in the Hendersons' living room, bringing together landowners who were reluctant to sell and those who were still undecided. Marcus created detailed presentations showing Peterson's track record, the environmental impact of similar developments, and the long-term economic effects on rural communities. Frank contributed his credibility as a long-time resident and his practical knowledge of land use and construction. He could explain in concrete terms what minimal environmental impact really meant when you were building roads, installing septic systems, and maintaining golf courses in mountainous terrain. The campaign wasn't without its challenges. Peterson proved to be a skilled opponent, increasing his offers to wavering landowners while simultaneously pressuring them with deadlines and warnings about missing out on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He hired local lawyers to research property titles, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit. He even began making personal visits to holdouts, using his considerable charm and persuasive abilities to overcome resistance. "He came by yesterday," Betty Henderson told Frank during one of their strategy meetings. "Spent 2 hours on our front porch, talking about how much easier our lives would be with his money in the bank. He's very convincing, Frank. I can see why some people are tempted." "What did you tell him?" "That we weren't interested in easy," Tom Henderson replied. "We came here for the same reasons you did. To build something meaningful, something that lasts. Money can't buy that." But not everyone shared the Hendersons' perspective. The Johnson family, down by the creek, signed a contract with Peterson, lured by an offer that would pay off their mortgage and fund their retirement dreams. The organic farmers, despite their initial resistance, began wavering when Peterson offered enough money to buy a larger farm in a more accessible location. "We're losing them," Marcus told his father after a particularly discouraging community meeting. "Peterson's picked off the most financially vulnerable families, and now he's working on the ones who are emotionally attached but practical enough to be tempted by security." Frank sat quietly for a moment, considering their options. They'd been fighting Peterson's campaign for 6 weeks, and while they'd slowed his progress, they hadn't stopped it. The developer still controlled about half the valley and showed no signs of giving up. "Maybe it's time to change our strategy," Frank said finally. "What do you mean?" "We've been fighting defensively, trying to convince people not to sell. What if we went on the offensive instead?" Marcus looked intrigued. "How?" "Peterson needs our land to make his project work, but we need something from him too. We need him to go away." "What if we offered him something he wants more than our valley?" "Like what?" Frank smiled, the expression of a man who had spent decades solving problems that others thought were impossible. "Like a way to save face while making even more money somewhere else. You said his timeline was aggressive because of pressure from investors. What if we gave him reasons to believe this project was going to be more trouble and take longer than he originally planned?" Marcus began to understand where his father was heading. Make it so expensive and time-consuming that he decides to invest his energy somewhere else. Exactly. We can't outbid him for our neighbors' properties, but we might be able to make him believe that the obstacles to development here are too significant to justify the investment. They spent the next week researching everything they could about the regulatory and environmental challenges that would face Peterson's development. Marcus contacted environmental organizations, historic preservation groups, and legal aid societies that specialized in land use issues. Frank used his construction knowledge to identify potential engineering problems that would increase costs and delay construction. Their breakthrough came when Marcus discovered that the valley contained several species of plants and animals that were protected under state environmental laws. A proper environmental impact study would take at least 18 months to complete, and if significant populations of protected species were found, the development could be blocked entirely. "This is it," Marcus said excitedly, showing Frank the documentation he'd found. "If we can get environmental groups involved, they can demand comprehensive studies that will tie up Peterson's project for years. By the time he gets through the regulatory process, his investors will have moved on to other opportunities." Frank felt a surge of pride in his son's research and strategic thinking. "How do we make this happen?" "We contact every environmental organization in the region and show them what Peterson is planning. We document the wildlife habitats that would be destroyed, the watershed impacts, the effects on air quality, and scenic values. We turn this into a cause that's bigger than just our local property rights." The environmental campaign proved to be exactly the leverage they needed. Within 2 weeks of contacting state and regional conservation groups, Peterson found himself facing organized opposition that went far beyond a few stubborn landowners. Environmental lawyers filed formal challenges to his preliminary development plans, Scientists requested access to conduct biological surveys that would take months to complete. Local media began covering the story as a classic battle between development and conservation. Peterson's smooth confidence began to crack under the pressure. The quick, quiet acquisition he'd planned was turning into a prolonged public battle that attracted exactly the kind of scrutiny he preferred to avoid. His investors, who had been expecting rapid returns, grew nervous about the timeline and potential costs. The end came more quickly than Frank had expected. Peterson called him on a Thursday morning in November, his voice lacking the smooth charm it had carried during their first conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I want to make you one final offer. 5 times market value, closing within 2 weeks. This is my absolute best proposal. And if I refuse, then I'll be withdrawing from this project entirely. The regulatory environment here has become too complicated for the type of development we specialize in. My company will be focusing our resources on more favorable markets." Frank felt a surge of triumph, but kept his voice carefully neutral. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Peterson, but my answer remains the same. My property is not for sale." "I see. Well, then I suppose our business is concluded. Good luck to you, Mr. Morrison." After Peterson hung up, Frank walked out to the front porch where Marcus was working on replacing some loose floorboards. His son looked up expectantly. "Peterson's pulling out," Frank said simply. "It's over. We won." Marcus set down his hammer and stood up, a grin spreading across his face. "We actually did it. We beat him." "We did it together," Frank corrected. "I couldn't have managed this without your research, your strategic thinking, your willingness to fight for something that mattered." Marcus felt tears threatening as the full impact of their victory hit him. They hadn't just saved the valley. They'd rebuilt their relationship through shared struggle, common purpose, and mutual respect. The man who had thrown his father out 3 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some things were worth more than money, worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that these past few months have been the most meaningful of my adult life. Not just because we won this fight, but because I got to work alongside you again, because I remembered what it felt like to be your son." Frank walked over and pulled Marcus into a hug, the first real embrace they'd shared since before Helen's death. "You've always been my son," he said quietly. "Even when we couldn't find our way back to each other, that never changed." They stood together on the porch, looking out over the valley that would remain unchanged, the community they'd helped preserve, the home they'd fought to protect. The guest house where Marcus had spent the past 4 months was no longer a temporary refuge. It had become a permanent part of the family property, a place where he could build a new life while remaining connected to his roots. Marcus had found work with a regional environmental consulting firm, using his business skills to help communities navigate the same kind of challenges they'd faced with Peterson. The pay was less than half what he'd earned in corporate finance, but the work felt meaningful in ways his previous career never had. "You know what the best part is?" Marcus said, still looking out over the valley. "What's that?" 3 years ago, I threw you out because I thought family was something I could afford to lose if it interfered with my other priorities. But now, I understand that family isn't something you have in addition to everything else. Family is the foundation everything else is built on. Lose that, and nothing else really matters." Frank smiled, thinking about the retaining wall they'd rebuilt together, how the new structure was stronger than the original because they'd taken the time to do it right. "Took us a while to figure that out," he said. "But we got there," Marcus replied, "and we've got time to make up for what we lost." Day, as the sun set over the mountains they'd fought to preserve, Frank realized that sometimes the most valuable victories weren't the ones that brought you what you wanted, but the ones that showed you what you already had. He'd built this cottage as a refuge from loss and disappointment, never imagining it would become the place where his family was reborn. The valley was safe. The relationship with his son was restored. And Frank Morrison, at 63 years old, discovered that some stories have happy endings after all. Not because everything turns out perfectly, but because people find the courage to fight for what matters most.